Hey there! Ever seen the news say the government is blowing billions on something ridiculous while the country is drowning in debt? People got furious and panicked. But do you know that almost every country on Earth has debt? India, Germany, Switzerland, Qatar, you name it. Even big, rich nations aren't safe from debt. Japan owes twice its entire economy, and the US a cool $36 trillion debt and still counting. Sounds crazy, right? But here's what most people don't realize. National debt isn't just about overspending. It's a complex system that actually fuels global economies. When you hear debt, you might think of financial doom, but governments use it strategically to maintain stability, fund growth, and handle crises. So, have you ever wondered why are countries in debt? Why don't they just print unlimited money? Is debt really that bad? And if countries owe money, who are they borrowing from? And can a country ever be debt-free? So in this video, we'll talk all you need to know about debt, what it is, how it works, and why it's both a danger and a necessity. Let's get started. Section 1. What is national debt? If we mention a country's debt, we call it national debt. National debt, also called public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt, is the total money a federal or central government owes. Just like people take out loans when they need money, governments borrow when they spend more than they earn. But instead of borrowing from a single bank, countries get loans from various sources like other nations, big financial institutions, and even their own citizens. National debt only includes federal or central government debt. So, U.S. national debt only includes U.S. federal government's debt, but doesn't include local or state debt, like California or Texas debts. Yeah, states or provinces can take debts for their own projects, like building roads, schools, or hospitals, which is different from federal or central government debt. National debt also doesn't include American citizens' personal debt, like credit cards, student loans, or mortgages. So when you hear the US owes $36 trillion, that's only the federal government. Not the people, not the companies, not the states. But here's the twist. National debt is actually an ongoing cycle. Governments issue bonds and loans, repay old debts, and borrow again. It's not meant to be paid off forever, but managed continuously. Countries like the US have had debt since their founding. It's part of how modern economies function. Now that you've understood what national debt is, your next question is, why do countries borrow in the first place? Let's find out. Section 2. Why do countries borrow money? Why do governments need to borrow money when they can just print more money? Well, when governments print money mindlessly, they think they have unlimited money and will spend recklessly, flooding the economy with cash. This will cause hyperinflation, make prices skyrocket, and crash the economy. As a result, investors in foreign countries will lose trust and think of the money as worthless as toilet paper. This already happened in Venezuela and Zimbabwe, where inflation got so bad that people used banknotes as wallpaper or toys. Borrowing, however, keeps them disciplined as debt comes with interest, forcing governments to manage their money more responsibly as they need to repay it. If you want more explanation, check out my other video, Why Don't We Just Print More Money? Link in the description. Now, let's look at why governments borrow in the first place. 1. To cover budget deficits. A government's main income comes from taxes, but sometimes it's not enough to cover expenses. This is called a budget deficit. For example, if the government collects $3 trillion in taxes, but needs $4 trillion to fund education, healthcare, and public services, taxes. That leaves a $1 trillion gap. So, what are the options? Cutting spending means fewer services, worse education, and underfunded healthcare. People won't be happy and will probably protest the next day. Raising taxes makes life harder for everyone and might lead to even bigger protests. So, the easiest solution is borrowing money to cover the deficit. Almost every country does this. For instance, the US government has run a deficit nearly every year since the 1970s, meaning it borrows almost every year. And many European nations do the same. Borrowing fills the gap between what a country earns and what it must spend to function. 2. To invest in growth. Borrowing isn't always a bad thing. Imagine your country needs roads, schools, and hospitals, but the government has no money and refuses to borrow. Instead of building them now, they would have to wait years to save up. In the meantime, people struggle with bad roads, lack of schools, and poor health care. But if the government borrows, they can build these things now, helping people sooner and improving the economy faster. These investments create jobs, boost productivity, and improve quality of life. The more people work and earn, the more taxes the government collects, which can eventually make it easier to pay off the debt later. For example, South Korea borrowed heavily in the 1960s to 1980s to invest in industries and infrastructure, transforming itself from a poor nation into a high-tech powerhouse. 3. To handle crises and emergencies. Sometimes governments have no choice but to borrow. When unexpected events like wars, natural disasters, or pandemics happen, they need to act fast. For example, in 2020 alone, the US borrowed $3.8 trillion, about 18% of its GDP, for COVID-19 relief, stimulus checks, and business aid. Without this, the economy could have been worse, and millions more might have lost their jobs. The same thing happens after earthquakes, wars, or energy crises. Borrowing provides a safety net that allows governments to keep the economy alive when everything else stops. 4. To pay off existing debt. You're not the only one who takes loans to pay off old loans. Governments have mastered this trick better than you. Let's say a country borrowed money in 2010 with a repayment deadline in 2020. But when 2020 arrives, it can't afford to pay it back. What does it do? Take another loan in 2020 to repay the 2010 debt. This cycle will keep going. As long as the country manages its debt responsibly, it's not necessarily a problem. But if debt spirals out of control, disaster follows, like Sri Lanka, which defaulted on its $51 billion external debt in 2022, leading to protests and political collapse. 5. To control interest rates and inflation. Sometimes governments borrow money as a financial tool, not just because they're short on cash. By issuing bonds, they can control inflation, stabilize their currency, and influence interest rates. For example, when inflation is too high, governments can issue bonds to pull money out of the economy, reducing inflation. On the other hand, when the economy is too slow, they can borrow more to inject money and stimulate growth. It's not simple, but it's how modern economies stay balanced. This is why economists often say debt isn't just about spending too much, it's also about controlling the rhythm of the economy itself. Now that we know why countries borrow money, the next question is, who is actually lending them all this money? Let's find out. Section 3. Who lends money to countries? Bonds, IMF, World Bank. You realize that governments often take on billions, sometimes trillions of dollars in debt. And you might be wondering which bank has trillions of dollars lying around to lend. Well, the government doesn't just borrow from one source. They borrow from three main ones: domestic lenders, foreign lenders, and their own central bank. Let's break it down step by step. 1. Domestic lenders. First, we have domestic lenders, people and institutions within the country who lend money to the government by buying bonds and treasuries. When you buy a government bond, you're basically lending your money to the government, which pays you back later with interest. Not just citizens, banks like J.P. Morgan, pension funds, and even government agencies buy these bonds because they're low-risk investments. For example, the U.S. Social Security Trust Fund invests its surplus in Treasury bonds to earn interest. As of March 2025, around $7.3 trillion, about 20% of U.S. national debt, is intra-governmental debt, meaning the government owes money to itself. This system keeps money circulating safely within the economy while giving citizens a stable way to invest in their own country. Foreign lenders. Next are foreign lenders, investors, banks, and even governments from other countries that buy a nation's bonds. For example, Japan and China each hold around $700 billion to $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. They do this because the U.S. economy is considered one of the safest in the world, and U.S. bonds are viewed as a secure way to earn steady returns. This doesn't mean the U.S. is controlled by them. It simply reflects global confidence in the U.S. economy and its ability to repay debt. On the other hand, countries with weaker or unstable economies often struggle to attract such foreign investment. Instead, they rely on international organizations like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, or African Development Bank, which provide low-interest loans for development projects, but usually come with strict conditions and transparency requirements. 3. The IMF, the lender of last resort. When a country's economy collapses and no one else will lend, it turns to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Unlike the World Bank, the IMF doesn't fund projects. It gives emergency loans to stabilize currencies, stop financial panic, and restore confidence. But IMF help comes with strict conditions: cutting government spending, raising taxes, privatizing state companies, and reforming the currency. These steps aim to fix the economy but often cause short-term pain for citizens. Countries like Greece, Argentina, and Indonesia all took IMF loans and faced austerity measures, rising unemployment, and protests. So while the IMF can save economies from collapse, it often does so at a heavy social cost, making it both a savior and a controversy. 4. Central banks. Lastly, countries can borrow from their own central banks, a process called debt monetization, where the central bank creates new money to buy government bonds. This helps fund spending, but also increases the money supply, risking inflation or even hyperinflation if overused. That's why most modern economies avoid direct borrowing. Instead, central banks like the Federal Reserve buy bonds indirectly from commercial banks through open market operations, mainly to control inflation and interest rates, not to finance the government directly. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, the Fed bought huge amounts of bonds to keep borrowing costs low and stabilize the economy. So yes, governments can technically borrow from themselves, but it's a powerful tool that must be used carefully. Now that we know who lends to countries, let's explore the next big question. Is national debt really a bad thing? Section 4. Is national debt a bad thing? Debt-to-GDP ratio, debt ceiling. Well, not really. Debt can be good or bad depending on how it's used and whether a country can manage it properly. When used wisely, debt becomes a tool for growth. When abused, it becomes a ticking time bomb. When debt is good, debt can be beneficial if used for long-term investment, like building infrastructure, improving education, and strengthening healthcare. Borrowing during crises, such as COVID-19, help stabilize the economy and prevent collapse. It's similar to how a family might use a mortgage to buy a home, a responsible loan that builds long-term value. For instance, Singapore borrows even though it has plenty of money. Why? To build strong financial credibility and keep investors engaged. Smart borrowing can actually make a country more trusted by global markets. When debt becomes dangerous, debt turns dangerous when a country borrows just to repay old loans, falling into a debt trap. As debt grows, interest payments eat up more of the national budget, sometimes costing more than healthcare or education. When investors lose confidence, credit rating agencies like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch downgrade the country's rating. That forces it to pay higher interest rates, worsening the debt spiral. We saw this happen in Greece, 2010s, and Sri Lanka, where rising debt led to defaults, inflation, and protests. How much debt is too much? Economists measure this using the debt-to-GDP ratio, comparing what a country owes to what it produces. A ratio of 60% or less is generally safe, but it depends on the country's stability. For example, Japan's ratio exceeds 250%, yet it remains stable since most debt is held domestically. Meanwhile, Argentina defaulted multiple times with much lower ratios due to weak investor trust. The US even has a debt ceiling, a legal borrowing limit, but Congress usually raises it to avoid default, making it more political than financial. So, national debt isn't automatically bad. What matters is who owns it, why it exists, and whether it funds growth or fuels crisis. Now that we know when debt becomes dangerous, the next big question is, can a country ever be completely debt-free? 5. Can a country be debt-free? The Macau myth. Technically, yes, but in reality, no modern country is fully debt-free, and that's not even a good thing. The closest example is Macau, a region of China, not a country. It has no debt because it's small and earns billions from casinos. But big nations can't operate that way. If a government tried to erase all debt, it would need huge tax hikes or spending cuts, crashing the economy. Plus, government bonds are vital. They keep pension funds, insurers, and investors stable. So having some debt isn't bad. It's actually essential for a strong modern economy. Debt is a double-edged sword. Used wisely, it helps a country grow, build infrastructure, and handle crises. Used recklessly, it can destroy trust, wreck economies, and create chaos. So next time you hear someone ask, why does our country have debt? You already know the truth. It's not about having debt. It's about knowing how to manage it. And maybe you're still wondering why some countries handle massive debt just fine, while others collapse, or how debt ties nations together in the global financial web. That's a story for another video. If you want me to explain that next, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because we're just getting started. Thanks for watching.